Okay, so the lesson I chose was an area perimeter lesson. It is for sixth grade lower level, up to 80 minutes, and I'm just going to kind of peruse through this lesson plan, just to give you an idea. I will provide a link, obviously, to it, attached to this. One thing I didn't like, from a teacher's perspective is that it didn't necessarily list what the objectives are, but it is a very thorough and pretty long lesson. What I do really like about it is that it really touches on language objectives, which I think promotes the representation part of UDL. The materials are pretty simple. They provided it. Here, I'll scroll down to it. They provided some of the materials in this packet, in this lesson plan. I found this lesson plan on Teachers Pay Teachers, but it was a free lesson plan, so I thought, why not? You said not to overthink it, so I didn't. But when I downloaded it, I realized that it was a pretty long lesson, so I hope that I can go through this thoroughly and achieve some of the objectives that you're looking for as well. But just to go back, the materials are very simple. This is the kickoff of the lesson. I wasn't very happy with it, to be honest, but I will go into that. Essentially, you just tell the kids what they're going to be doing, and they're essentially going to be taking pieces of the fence and creating a fence for farm animals. And then they are going to break up into groups to do this. And so there really isn't an activation of prior knowledge, from my understanding of this. And then there is step-by-step instructions on exactly what to do and say throughout the lesson. And so I'm just gonna go over them really quickly. The first step is to verify that each group has an appropriate pen, and demonstrate a rectangular pen and explain size, length, width, and dimensions. Step 2 is ask member from each group to share their dimensions and describe the shape. 3, place transparency of grid paper on overhead or pictures on smartboard and explain that each student will draw their rectangle using the side of a square to represent a piece of a fence. Each student should draw their respective rectangle in pencil on the first grid and check with group mates. Step 5 is verify that each group has the correct rectangle. If they make a mistake, have them count the fence pieces on each side. 6, discuss what this rectangle represents. The fence and perimeter. Have students write above the grid the fence is the outside or the perimeter. Students then trace the rectangle only in brown to represent a brown fence. If students shade the area, ask if the inside part is the fence. Demonstrate on the overhead for the class that the fence is only the outside part. Ask the groups to determine what the inside part is. 9, lead a class discussion on what the inside represents, the grass and area, and have students write the inside space is the grass or the area. Students then shade in the area in green to represent grass. Demonstrate on the overhead that the area is the inside part. 11, ask students how much fence they used. Have each group share their total and explain how they computed it. 12, explain the fence as the perimeter and demonstrate that the perimeter is the sum of the sides. Show the calculation and have each student write perimeter, then show their calculation below. Explain the grass as the area and demonstrate finding area by counting squares. Have students count squares by writing the subsequent numbers in the square, i.e. 1 in the first box, 2 in the second, etc. Ask students how many squares are in the area. Have each group share their area and how they computed it. If no one offers multiplying length and width, explain this. Show the calculation and have each student write area, then show their calculation below. Write, compare, and contrast on the board and have students explain the terms. Have groups generate lists of how perimeter and area are alike and are different. Field examples from students and record on board. Summarize similarities and differences. Have each group create a fence with different dimensions and then record on the next grid. Emphasize that they are to do everything they did for the first. Verify each group has completed everything. Explain that they will now see a common mistake in a computing perimeter. Have each group set aside 10 of the fence pieces. Each group is not to build a fence using 10 pieces. They are only to build the bottom and the left side. They should also put their animals in the fence. Verify each group has only 10 pieces and 2 sides built. Ask students to explain what happens in real life. Ask them to compute the total fence pieces used. Ask for a summary of what happened and what's wrong. The animals run away because the fence is not completed. Explain that a common mistake is to compute perimeter using only length and width once. Demonstrate on overhead. Have students take out a lined sheet of paper and rulers. Walk students through creating a 3x4 rectangle using a horizontal line and the vertical line on the left side. Have them label the sides using inches. Ask the students to write perimeter and compute. Show work. Ask the students to write area and compute. Show work. Demonstrate on overhead, perimeter, and discuss units. Have them write inches next to their answers. Discuss how area was computed on grid paper, counting squares. Explain that area was a bunch of squares and that the area is 12 is 12 square inches. Demonstrate on overhead by drawing in squares and rectangles. Have students take a pop quiz. Formative assessment. A. Draw a 4x6 rectangle. Tell them it should not be actual feet. B. Compute perimeter. Show work. C. Compute area. Show work. On the last grid, and this is the closure, on the last grid, have students generate a rectangle with perimeter of 20 that has the maximum area possible. After students have had time, have students share results and record on the board in a 2-column table with the headings, length, width, and area. And 3, identify the maximum and ask students to explain how it is special. It's a square. And the students' work products would be a grid paper with various rectangles, a practice quiz, the assessment is the pop quiz, and the differentiation in this lesson plan is collaboration with individual support from teacher, individual work to monitor progress, and formative quiz to assess progress and understanding. So, I know that was kind of a lot, but I just wanted to kind of go through it before I went ahead and studied this particular lesson. So while I appreciate it being very, very thorough, I did take into consideration that this is for 6th grade lower level. So I assumed that by that, this is for 6th grade students who may not be up to par. And so this is a lesson for maybe struggling learners. And I liked that. I thought that that was cool. Although I thought that this particular lesson was kind of mundane. So what I do like about this lesson is that it contains many opportunities for motivation, collaboration, and optimizes on relevance, and value and authenticity for engagement. So the lesson is, it contains a lot of collaboration through the group work. It also encourages the teacher to be available for assistance. The teacher assists through tech, the smartboard, as students work together throughout different parts of the lesson. The lesson is successful at being goal and objective centered. So those were the things that I thought the lesson was very strong in as far as engagement. Now for representation, I think that this lesson kind of was lacking in that area, in my personal opinion, from what I understand of UDL. I thought that the lesson did do a great job of checking off some of the boxes, though. The lesson suggests using overhead or smartboard and the homemade manipulatives with the farm animals and the fence pieces down here below, and also with the grid paper. I think that this lesson does a phenomenal job of really going over a lot of the language for this particular these particular standards, more than one standard, but I just think that it's very heavily centered around language, and I don't know that a student could at all miss area and perimeter. They may not know the definition, but at least they would, know that it's something that was discussed for up to 80 minutes, because it's so intensive in this lesson. Um, I also thought that it was heavily centered around mathematical terms. Um, a lot of reminders for labeling throughout this lesson, like I said. Um, and I also think that the manipulatives that are being used in this lesson assist with the language of math in this particular lesson. So moving on to a couple of the things that I noticed for expression. The manipulatives are used for construction of the lesson. Um, the teacher does do a little bit of modeling, so a support for strategy development. There's also a lot of support for practice and performance in the group work. And it seemed to me that this lesson had a lot of teachers monitoring the progress. And I thought that it was good at guiding and goal setting. So I do think that this lesson does a phenomenal job as well in expression and just really getting in their hands-on action and expression, the students using their physical body to learn and be hands-on and achieve the goals of this lesson. The lesson calls for a practice quiz though, and then a pop quiz. Um, I don't think that is necessarily it's just not necessary in my opinion for this. I think that because the lesson is so long and kind of labor intensive, I don't think that it's necessarily fair to ask the students at the end of this lesson to do a pop quiz to show what they have learned. And then it's not only just the formal pop quiz, but it's also the informal practice quiz. So I'm really not sure what the lesson means by that. It didn't provide any documents for a quiz, so I'm sure it's just at the teacher's discretion. But when I hear pop quiz, I think of, a more formal assessment. There are also not a lot of options for tech in this lesson, which I thought was really unfortunate. The teacher does use the smartboard to project and model the lesson in and out throughout the lesson. And then there are, of course, the low-tech manipulatives of the farm animals and the fence, but that's about it. And I think that with this particular lesson, you could do so much. Well, there's also the grid paper, but there's so much, and I don't think that it necessarily supports UDL to the fullest in this regard. I also don't think that the students have a whole lot of choice in their own learning throughout this process. Like, for example, I just wanted to point this out, that the students have to use brown to represent the fence. Um, you know, I know it seems kind of small and silly, but that's not something that I think is necessarily important to distinguish in this lesson. And so it definitely was something that caught my eye. I didn't really understand why that was very important, because I think that, the fence could be any color. But I think that things like that help students kind of own their learning process if they get to choose, whatever works best for them. So I also thought that perhaps the lesson could have it might have been too wordy, not in the sense where it is using a lot of the math terms, but I think that it's wordy for math in the sense that it required a lot of writing. And so I thought that this would also be a great lesson to kind of teach students how to perhaps use symbols instead of words, or just use the A and the P, or even color code um, the learning process of this lesson. So I just want to move on to the third part of this study. A couple things that I think that I would do different to support UDL. Just gonna go over to this PowerPoint that I made right here. Got the UDL guidelines here. I will also attach this with the clip. But a couple things I would implement are more teaching strategies coupled with collaboration, tech options, a curious approach to learning, and to call for more student autonomy throughout their lesson. And what I mean by curious approach, I thought that this lesson did a really great job at kind of, taking a very investigative approach to learning. But it didn't seem like the teacher was part of that process too much outside of teaching. And I think that one thing is really cool, and one thing that students really respond to is when they notice that the teacher is learning with them and they feel motivated by that. So, that is what I mean when I say a more curious approach to teaching as a teaching strategy, and allowing students to kind of have more say in how they learn. It just seemed very cut and dry, and I know that 80 minutes is a really, really long time, even for sixth graders, and so I don't know how a lesson where students don't have much choice on how they can learn is going to be effective in this circumstance. So, for instance, rather than have a whole lot of discussions throughout the lesson, I might take the time out initially to confront their prior knowledge, which is also something that I thought the lesson lacked. I thought the lesson lacked confronting the prior knowledge of the students with that opening. And so one thing that I would want to do and make changes in as far as this lesson is to tap into the students' prior knowledge. And I think that it's so important, and it's such a intricate part of the lesson because there is so much that you can build off of in that kind of attention getter or that hook. And so a couple ways that I thought that I might do this to accommodate UDL and to tap into other intelligences of my students is to create an activity that addresses some of the vocab and the terms that were going to be used in the lesson. I would perhaps take this approach through a read aloud, some books addressing area and perimeter, or I would even do centers with different activities around the words that we will be approaching in the lesson. And then we can come back together for a more meaningful discussion. The centers could even be group work or individual. And a teaching strategy I would use to further creative collaboration would be the jigsaw technique. And the jigsaw technique allows the students to depend on one another to achieve the goal. So while the students are breaking up into groups and figuring out area, perimeter, and the fence, I would maybe try to assign each student in the group a specific part that is a step in the process of figuring out area and perimeter. So then the students not only have to collaborate, but they have to work together, and they each need each other in order to achieve the goal and find the problem. I would also, I'm sorry, I'm taking notes. Those are just a couple teaching strategies. I also wanted to point out in my picture, so we have students here working together. We have the teacher here modeling, and then the read aloud, like I mentioned. And this is a scavenger hunt photo that I found. I just think that scavenger hunts are a really fun way to kick off a lesson and kind of introduce students to vocab and some of the ideas that we would be approaching in the lesson. Moving on, I don't know why the lesson didn't have more technology. Maybe it's an older lesson, but I didn't feel like AT was much of an option throughout this lesson. So if I were to teach this lesson, I would definitely allow more AT options. And things to consider would be geo boards. I remember doing geo boards in elementary school, and I just thought they were so fun and they were so hands-on. They were really, really great learning tools. Also, I thought, the students being able to use a clipboard if they're going to be moving around the room. And then, of course, the lesson did mention smart boards, slant boards for students who may need it, the option to access the computers or texts or an iPad. Here is a really cool website that I found. It's called Really Sketch, and I already have a perimeter that I've drawn here. But yeah, you can just use the mouse to create, different area and perimeter on already lined graph paper. And students can use this with a stylus or on the iPad or, with their finger. So I thought that was also something that was really beneficial as well. Especially in regards to the graph paper. And these are some high-tech ATs, but I even thought of a couple different things as far as using different colors for the area and perimeter and the fence, or even taping down their fence pieces as they're working on them to kind of help them, keep things in place as they're trying to solve the problem. Anything that might help and that is accessible within the classroom. So I would even offer, like I mentioned before, symbols or, the color coding of the fence to students as perhaps an option to kind of gain a better understanding of length and width, area, and perimeter. So the main things I thought this lesson lacked were ATs, student autonomy in their own learning process, creative approaches to learning, and a solid investigation of or a tapping into prior knowledge. And I didn't necessarily even think that the lesson was all that age appropriate as far as these little animals. I know that seems kind of silly, but I think that age appropriateness is important. And so I probably would have went for something maybe a little more realistic or even a different scenario altogether, not necessarily a farmer and a fence. So things that I would hope to achieve in in my new and improved UDL lesson plan for area and perimeter, I would expect that students would have more ownership in their learning with this particular lesson. I would hope to engage in multiple teaching strategies to better accommodate each student at an individual level. I think spending a little more time on prior knowledge would create a more solid foundation to build the other skills since there are many goals to meet in this lesson. While the lesson met many engaging goals, I would hope to achieve more representation than I think the original lesson plan had. Through highlighting patterns through activities and optimizing access to ATs, supplying that background knowledge that the lesson kind of lacked, illustrating and modeling through media and manipulatives that also tie into the language of understanding, and through expression, I would hope to enhance varied methods, building fluencies through multiple strategies, incorporating practice and performance, and monitored progress of moving around, or even calling each group to a table for a brief progress review. This lesson seems pretty long already. Um, so my modifications, I would think, may split the lesson into 2 or even 3 parts. More resources such as access to tech, geoboards, markers, and tapes would be incorporated, and the formal and informal quiz for me would have to go. Students, one way that I would assess my students would be a fun and creative activity, such as students gluing down Cheez-Its or checks, and I would give them a problem, and they would have to show me how they came to the problem by gluing down the Cheez-Its and the checks and labeling each part of the area and the perimeter while also finding the answer. So I thought that this was a really, really great lesson. There really wasn't a whole lot wrong with it. I do think that maybe it's a little out of date and it doesn't quite accommodate all students and multiple intelligences, especially students with disabilities. So, considering that this is for 6th graders who may be struggling, I thought that that was kind of not cool, to be honest. But I hope that my modifications on this lesson plan would accommodate all of my students in more than one way. So that is my UDL lesson plan for area and perimeter.